God fucking damn it. Come the fuck on. Hey Al, should we test out the audio here?
Yeah. Can you hear me okay, Al?
Yep. And I need to make you a host, and I need to stop the recording because there's no point in recording this here. So
I really enjoy this evening, as am I. So thanks so much for being here.
Great. Thanks for that, Drew. Drew is not only a tree keeper, he also helps teach the Tree Keepers course. So some of you will get to know him better in about a month. I got to shoot you an email about that, Drew. Now, I did hear from somebody asking whether or not this is being recorded. This is being recorded, and I will share that out. Dan, I will find your tree keeper number for you, and you know what? I will get another badge made for you once I can get down and do such a thing. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us. And you know what, Al, why don't you just take it away? And again, people, just throw those questions and comments in the chat. I'll keep an eye on those, and hopefully we'll have good discussions and good questions. And take it away, Al.
Sounds good, Al, and thank you for the introduction, Drew. Can you guys all hear me okay?
Yep.
Good, excellent. Well, it's good to be with you today, and I'll just quickly pop on my video just to say hello to you all. And yeah, I appreciate you taking time out of your evening to learn a little bit about iTree. As Drew said, I am with the Davey Institute, which is part of the Davey Tree Expert Company. So same different tribes, all part of the same Davey Nation, I guess is the way to put it. But Davey Institute is sort of a kind of a smaller support unit of the greater Davey Tree Expert Company. So we support our service lines, but one of the things that we also do is we are part of the supporting iTree cooperative. So along with the U.S. Forest Service and many other organizations, we help develop and disseminate and support and provide some of the background research and cooperate with many different institutions to provide iTree tools. So what I'm going to do today is just kind of take you through a couple things. I kind of had to pick and choose because there's different paths that we could go on. But as Al said, I'm happy to go off script, and I'll stop at several points throughout and see if there's questions or comments, or if somebody sees something or is familiar. By all means, Al, if you're monitoring the chat, just interrupt me at any time. And so my plan for today was just to kind of start with the foundation, talk a little bit about some of the basic iTree concepts. And then I'm going to focus on a couple of the tools. And I'm going to start with Eco, and that's a little bit more of a complex tool, but understanding a bit about Eco will help you understand where do all the numbers come from. And so that is something that's kind of helpful just to kind of have a foundation. And then we'll talk a little bit about a very simple, accessible tool like MyTree. And then a tool that's a little bit newer called Landscape, which is one of my favorite tools, but it's a tool that kind of allows you to actually do some good case making and planning too. So it really brings a lot of information at your fingertips. So, but if anybody else wants to see other tools or talk about other tools, we can certainly talk about those and even explore those if you'd like. So I'm going to stop sharing video just to preserve a little bit of bandwidth. So let's just kind of start with the basics. Yeah, so iTree is free software developed by the U.S. Forest Service and those partners that I mentioned at the bottom, and those are changing and almost ever expanding. And much of this research goes back into the 90s, actually, I think, with the original Chicago Climate Project, which was looking at the effects of trees on climate change, which had to do more with mostly focusing on pollution removal and carbon sequestration. It since has evolved to include many different tools and many different researchers, mostly from the Forest Service, bringing many different applications to be housed under this one umbrella called iTree. And the idea was, how can we take urban forest research and put that into the hands of users? So, just moving away from here's an interesting paper, but how can we take these and turn them into tools that help volunteers or municipal tree managers or nonprofit organizations actually be more effective at their various objectives? And so the underlying foundation is science, and so realizing that there is a lot to these tools. iTree also provides technical support, and it is constantly changing. So we like to say they're dynamic, and that could be both good and bad because the tools change on you, and that could be challenging too, as you always have to keep up with the new technology. And I don't know if folks are familiar with like the basic premise of like a tree inventory, which is kind of more of a standard, I like to call it an asset management type tool where you just go out and take basic information, characteristics about the tree, like species and DBH, and most people are interested in the maintenance and things like that. That's good structural information. And we build on that structural information in iTree. And what we want to do is use that structural information along with a variety of other information to find out what is the functional information. So what are the functions that those trees are providing, or the ecosystem services? And then are there ways that we can value those services too? So we take some of that basic data that tree managers usually may have just for more basic day-to-day management, but we want to try to understand, what is it providing to communities, and then what are the values to communities? And then ultimately that allows us to be more effective and strategic, both with management and planning. So if we are interested in things like climate change, then we will be interested in things like carbon sequestration, but also energy savings, pollution removal. And then, say we're interested in stormwater aspects, and then we could look at things like interception and other hydrological characteristics that trees are providing. And so that's the whole premise of iTree. So you'll always hear that kind of structure, function, value is the basic foundation. A number of different applications are now available in iTree. When I first started about 12, 13 years ago, many of these tools didn't exist, and some of them have changed. There was just about 4 or 5 original tools, and some of them have been phased out and folded into other tools. This is kind of a nice way of looking at some of the most important applications. We have a few others that didn't even make the starting lineup that I have up here. But you can kind of see that we have what we call the core programs, those center blue programs: eco, canopy, design, landscape. And then we have derivatives off those. And so the ones up at the top, we like to call utilities. They're a little bit more easier tools to use, but they're kind of usually based off some of the original core programs. So as you can see, one of the common things or the common themes is how eco is really that kind of central tool where there's arrows disseminating from eco and both pointing back to it. And so, eco is a critical tool. So we use that tool to derive some of the estimates for some of the more easier tools that we build, like iTree, planting, species, and design, but also for more sophisticated tools like landscape and county. So we use eco you'll hear me use the term, it's the engine for many of the other tools. And then there's another tool called iTree Hydro, which is more of a background processing tool now that was originally a watershed scale modeling tool that has been kind of folded in to be the, say, hydrology estimator for eco and now also for the other tools. But that is kind of more of a sophisticated application even beyond iTree eco. And so that kind of more is like what we like to call a science or research grade type application. Another way of looking at these is web-based versus desktop tools. And when I first started also, over a decade ago, all these tools required you to install software, and it was just very clunky and time consuming and challenging, and we used to distribute CDs, and it was just a pain to get through. We still have some remnants of that. Two of the softwares, Eco and Hydro, require installation on a Windows-based desktop operating system, but we've tried to move more to running tools in web browsers, and so that way they're more easily accessible, and it's easier to update, and it's a lot simpler to use. So we try to kind of move away from that, and at someday we could probably hope that Eco will probably at least be more of a simplified tool. Right now, it's still fairly sophisticated and requires, it can be challenging to get it running because it does a lot of external communication, pulling in various data sets. Another way of looking at iTree is like, what is the scale you're interested in? Usually when people are interested in for the first time and saying, well, I'm interested in using iTree, and then you run up against all these different applications and, where do I go from here? It's a bit daunting to try to make decisions. And usually I try to kind of ask the question is like, what are your objectives? What are your resources? What is your timeline? And those are the things that kind of help determine what is your scale that you're interested in doing a project. And so that way you can kind of narrow down like what are the particular tools that might help you. And then also knowing the tools will help you improve the decision making. So it is a bit challenging when you see all these different tools, and some of them have some redundancies in what they do. Like design, planting, and iTree are fairly similar, but there are some differences. Landscape and canopy are aerial assessment tools, meaning that we're looking at things from a top-down perspective. Eco is kind of just the all-encompassing tool that requires field data. Some of these are a little bit more flexible, like Eco can work at any scale, but a tool like design, planting, and iTree tend to be a little bit more smaller scale, like a tree planting type project. Type scale as opposed to a citywide type scale where you might look for something like Eco to use there. But they are flexible, so you can go in many different directions. Efforts or complexity is another way of looking at these tools too. And really, I kind of like to think of canopy, landscape design, planting, and iTree is all fairly easy to learn. These are all online tools that you could really just kind of learn, mostly just sitting down and playing with them within a couple of days. Eco, there's a bit of a gap there, so that takes more time, but it's actually been simplified quite a bit too, where you can actually do some fairly quick and easy things with Eco now, whereas in the past you couldn't. So it used to have very rigid data variables that you had to provide, not just species and DBH. You had to do all types of crown measurements and a number of different variables just to enter in data for one tree. Now it's much more flexible, so it's more accessible, easier to use, but it still requires a little bit more in terms of time and commitment to master that tool. So that's just kind of a basic framework on the concept of some of the tools and how they compare to each other. What I'm going to try to do now is just look at Eco. So again, Eco is that engine, right? So Eco is a tool that we use to kind of build all other tools off of. And so this is a field-based tool. So it requires us to have some information about the tree that we're interested or the forest resource. So we need to know something about species, size of those trees to at least start using this. You can import that data in. So many times you might have that, say, like in a planting list or an existing inventory. So that's also an option for using Eco. It has data collection capabilities, so you can actually use a mobile device to go out and collect data in the field and enter it into, say, like a smartphone, and then transfer that to a server and into Eco, and then run the analysis on it too. This particular tool can work at multiple scales, so you can do a single tree now, or you can do the whole city of Chicago. Right now, Morton Arboretum is in the process of analyzing data from 7 counties into regional study, the Chicago Regional Tree Initiative, where they're doing the 2020 analysis, and that's using Eco. And then so a variety of different reports, both on structure, tree structure, function, and value. And so this again is the most dynamic tool, constantly changing, that we use to run all our other tools off of, to try to unify them so they're all using kind of consistent science and methodology. When I first started using ECO, it was called the U4, the Urban Forest Effects Model. And so this was a tool that was developed by Dr. Dave Nowak. And one of the earliest studies that he did actually was in Chicago with this tool, but there's been other studies too, many studies, but it was used mainly by municipalities back then. It was very complex and just a significant time and learning commitment to use this. But now it's really used just about by everybody and anybody. Even high school kids use iTree Eco occasionally for projects too. So it's become much more accessible from a variety of different users. And so it's something I would encourage you not to be afraid of. It's just a little bit of a time and commitment, but it's something that you can actually progress to, but it does provide a ton of different types of information. A little bit about like the underlying ECO and iTree model, just so you kind of understand like what is this model trying to do. So as I mentioned, it starts with that information about your tree. And so what we're trying to do is like understand different species have different leaf characteristics, different growth characteristics, different size characteristics too. And so that, is something that we can get from the data that you can provide by measuring that. And it's always beneficial if you can actually go out there in the field and measure that and then provide that data. But in many cases you can't, and you might just have the tree species and the diameter and the condition. And then in that case, the model will make estimates of what is the tree height based on species and trunk diameter, what is the crown width. So the accuracy of the model can be improved greatly if you actually take these measurements, but that can require more time. Then what the model has is a lot of data that's stored in it about the location. So if you're working in the city of Chicago, it takes into consideration the length of the growing season, elevation, sun angles, things like that based on latitude and longitude, which affect growth rate. All these different things are, in the location data, but also population, human population characteristics, and what are, the common species. Species database is probably about 8,000, 9,000 trees now, but because this tool is used globally. And then there's also pollution data and weather data. So this model also requires hourly pollution, hourly weather. And so it's trying to get at like, how is your tree interacting in its local environment? How is leaf surface interacting with pollution, with weather, taking into consideration all these variables? And then the model is going to do these estimates to try to give you what is the air quality improvement, the carbon sequestered, stormwater reduce, and energy effects. And then it also has human health related to air quality improvement. So if it is reducing air quality, there is an underlying EPA model that says if we are reducing, say, a certain amount of pollutants like particulate matter or sulfur dioxide, there is a health benefit, a public health benefit to that. And the EPA's BenMap model actually can help us quantify that and say, okay, if we are removing a certain amount of particulate matter, that is going to equate to a certain amount of less asthma incidents or less hospitalizations, less lost school days for children. So that's kind of the next phase where we are moving, is trying to make this connection to public health with trees. And, as I said, it starts with those measurements. So these are actually critical to the model. So we take into consideration, both size, leaf texture, leaf characteristics, and that varies. So if you think of like a honey locust tree leaf compared to a sugar maple leaf or a plane tree leaf, very different surfaces. And so competition here is also taken into consideration because that affects growth. We also then take into consideration pollution and weather to see how that's reacting. And so, this is a bit of just kind of a very simplistic way, but in the model, what we have is like all that hourly information. So this is just, looking at the hourly ozone over the course of a year, the hourly precipitation. So pollution, weather, and then at the bottom, the model is estimating the hourly air quality improvement by trees for ozone. So, you'll see that in the center there, say between March and October, that's where your greatest activity is. And that's because that's when trees are leafed out, right? So that's the growing season impact when you're having the most impact or the effect for air quality improvement. So all these variables, so say if a year is particularly more rainy than one of the previous years, that will affect the pollution removal for that year. So you can actually model different years too to see how, say, a year that's has higher drought might compare with one or precipitation. So many different variables are taken into consideration with ECO. And, just the types of information. So again, going back to that structure, function, value, when I say structure, what I'm talking about is like the physical characteristics and the distribution of trees. So the number of different species, how they're distributed throughout the landscape, the diversity, but also like things like the diameter distribution. And that's what this chart is showing you. It's a bit of a kind of a cumbersome chart to look at, but what this is showing you is different species and the diameters at the bottom and their percentage on that right side going up. So you can see that first orange one is the diameter distribution for pin oak. That gray one in the center is London plane tree. So this is kind of one of the neat little examples where it kind of gives you a snapshot. London plane tree is probably a mature tree, just looking at this chart from what I could tell, but it's probably not being planted as much anymore. If I go back and look towards the left at the bottom, the 0 to 3, 3 to 6 dBH, that tells me, well, what are the trees that are being planted? So I could see this cherry tree is being planted. So this tells me what the urban forest was, what it's transitioning to, and what's being planted, what's heading down the way in the future. And so, from this little snapshot, without seeing the urban forest or knowing anything about it, you can kind of tell quite a bit. So that's kind of, the benefit of like structural analysis. And to me, structure, and you'll hear this from Dr. Nowak, structure is so critical because we make those decisions, right? That's one of the things that people can control to some extent. We decide what are the species we're planting, where we're going to planting, are we going to make an adequate planting space for these? What is going to be the post-planting care? Those types of things are things that we can kind of control and then advocate for policies to improve that. So knowing that, that's going to help us plan. If we want to have forest functions that are critical to us, it all starts with understanding structure. So that's one of the, the important things to think about. Most people focus on the tree benefits, the function side, but it all starts with structure. And so the functional analysis, so yeah, this deals more with the air pollution removal, energy effects, stormwater runoff, and carbon storage and sequestration. Those are kind of considered the key, the four main ones that you'll see throughout most of the iTree models, those four common ones: pollution, energy, stormwater, and carbon. But also there's like structural value, which is trying to give more of a physical replacement value. And then ECO provides a number of different other reports. Some of these are very limited, like avian habitat suitability. It's really only 9 different species just because it's a limited range of species that a particular researcher was working on. But we are constantly trying to find ways to integrate in things like wildlife or stress effects or UV impacts, just other ways that we can make connections of what are the values that trees are providing to communities. And just a quick snapshot of, how is this used? So I mentioned that the Morton Arboretum is doing a fairly large scale project. Many other cities, so this is just an example of the city of Philadelphia who did a study a few years ago. And so when you do a citywide study, you aren't going to be able to count every single tree throughout a city. So you use random plots, and you would go visit these plots. And in ECO's case, it recommends a 1/10 acre plot. You would collect vegetation within those plots, enter that into the model, and it would do the analysis and extrapolate up the estimates. So this could be very time consuming and require significant training to do a study like this. And the idea with random plots is that you could end up in anywhere. So you could end up in the middle of the forest reserves where you are measuring a ton of buckthorn, and it could take you all day to do. We've seen plots that have ended up in the middle of prison yards, on the decks of aircraft carriers, all types of random places. And so there are protocols for avoiding those places, but it's interesting and challenging, and it gives you some really good information though at a citywide scale. And so you can start to see, what are the trees for different land uses that are providing, say, the most benefits. So in this particular case, what they found in Philadelphia is that the city's parks, which was one of the land uses that they were looking at, those parks are providing 40% of the overall benefits. And then with emerald ash borer, which is, still a concern, probably more so, in the Midwest, we've kind of gone through, I think, much of the hardest part with that, but then out east, that's still a more significant problem. They can start looking at things like, what is the impact to ash trees or other species? What are the species that are providing the most benefits? So you get a ton of different types of information for large scales, but you can also do it at smaller scales too. So this is just an example of a student project looking at trees on a campus, on a college campus. I believe this is University of Penn. And so this is part of a thesis project. And just again, going out and collecting the campus trees, but then being able to look at the analysis of those trees, and then just being able to compare that. And so you can see those trees in the background were planted in the 50s. There were 6 London planes, and because they're older stature trees, mature trees, they are storing much more carbon compared to 1,300 smaller trees that were planted more recently. So you can see the comparison of what 6 very large mature trees compared to small trees are. And so how can this be used? It's not to say that the importance of tree planting isn't there. It's just that, it is very difficult and long. It's an investment in time and a commitment to get a tree to maturity. And so, this is a type of information that could be used for, say, tree preservation. And so it's also just a good way of making the case for tree maintenance and care too, and proper planting over time, where you're going to see the most benefits. So that's iTree Eco. And so that kind of, I just wanted to give you that foundation of like what that particular model could do, multiple scales, and multiple entry points for using that tool, both like random sampling or just individual trees. So are there any questions, Al, or I'll stop right here before I go on to something else.
Yeah, we did get a couple of questions in. One, our forestry trainee and tree keeper from last year, Pete, asked if there's an app for this. I assume you mean for cell phone. And I'll let you answer that, and then we'll move on to the next question.
So the actual software where you kind of store the data runs on a desktop computer, but to go out and collect tree data, it's not really an app, but what it is a web form. So it runs on a phone, runs on an iPad, and it's basically just like a form that would open up from a link in your browser. So, it opens up in Google Chrome on a phone, or Firefox, or iOS on an Apple device. And that allows you to collect data for your project. What that does is you can then send that to a server, and then the project manager would be able to pull that into the project. So that's sort of how it kind of works within iTree. It doesn't have an app that allows you to actually store data like physically on a phone. It just acts as kind of a transfer mechanism from field to server to project.
Great. And Pete, let me know if you were looking for a different or different sort of answer than that. Great. Thanks, Pete. And then Tree Keeper Ruda, one of our real rock star tree keepers up in Rogers Park, asked, are these tools available on a Mac?
So the short answer is no. Eco requires a Windows-based operating system to run, but it can run in a shell on a Mac. So I know that there's a couple people in the Forest Service that I work with who run Eco on a Mac, but it's in a Windows shell. I think it's called Parallel. So basically, it's like a program that runs a Windows environment on a Mac. So that's the only way that you can use Eco, on a Mac currently. And the simple reason is that for us to build these tools on a Mac, free tools, that means that we have to have programmers to do that, updating these. So it's, with limited funding, that's just one of the things where we've never crossed that bridge yet. I suppose it will at some point, but that's something that I can't see like happening soon. So that's kind of the way that you can use it, but unfortunately not, native for a Mac.
Great, thanks for that. And then we got a question that actually is more for me. Let me click back over to read it. It says, is anyone working to help maintain the street trees that are getting girdled at the root flare because of iron gates? Those trees are probably in tree pits or AKA tree coffins. Now, if you see that in the city of Chicago, Dan, I don't believe that's one of the things you can note in the 311 app. In which case, if you see that, you can let me know and we can pass that on to Bureau of Forestry. If you see that in a different village, like I think you said you were in, let me scroll back up. You are in
Westchester, but I'm in this city quite a bit.
Oh, okay. Yeah, if you see that in Chicago, I believe I've heard that that's not actually one of the things you can report via the 311 app.
Okay.
If you can send me a picture and an exact address, and we can send that up to forestry. We've had tree keepers note that before, and usually forestry is like, hey, we can't be everywhere, so they appreciate tree keepers bringing that to their attention. We did have some creative tree keepers who suggested that they would go out and take care of the problem themselves, and Bureau of Forestry said, just let us know, and we'll go ahead and take care of that. So. And that goes for any number of things. If you don't have a way to report it, just let me know and we can pass it on. So thank you for that question. That does come up on occasion. So we are all caught up at the moment, unless anybody else have a question that came to mind hearing those. Generally speaking, we want a rich discussion, and don't be shy about asking questions. Here's your chance. And we'll pause again. So I would say back to you, Al. Thanks, and just carry on. And people, if you do have questions, don't feel like there's anything like, oh, I shouldn't ask this or something. Please ask away while you have the opportunity. So back to you for the moment, Al.
Yeah, that sounds good, Al. And actually, I do appreciate that tree grate question, because that's one of the things that I used to live in the Galewood neighborhood, and used to drive me mad too. Like, I was wondering, should I get a torch out and try to fix these myself? So what's the process? So, but that does tie into it, right? So, I mean, it's like it takes 7-8 years for that tree to start growing into that ring. And that's where, being able to kind of talk about the benefits of trees helps. Here's why we need to come back and monitor and maintain these. So with that, what I wanted to do is go out to the farthest ring here, over here on iTree, and talk a little bit about that tool now. So iTree kind of really simplifies everything and takes, we had a tool called iTree Design, which is more of another desktop application or tool that ran okay on an iPad, but it was very clunky when we started, seeing more people using. I'm amazed what everybody does on their phones now. That the younger generation doesn't even use laptops anymore. Everything's on a phone, so it's kind of So we're trying to get there too. And so this is kind of our foray in trying to kind of develop an application that takes a lot of what I just showed you in iTree Eco, pre-processes it so that we can kind of serve up benefits on the fly. And so the reason I wanted to show you this one, because as tree keepers, this is something that, if you have a cell phone in your pocket, you basically have iTree on the go. It's something that you can kind of stand out if you're talking with a homeowner and say, here's your mature tree that's providing X amount of benefits. We're trying to plant new trees because we know that, in time, we're going to need new trees to replace old trees and so forth. And, kind of why you should care, but also just it's something that's very accessible and simple. We're constantly trying to do more things to this particular tool. So this is one of Dave Nowak, who is our project leader, one of the tools that he works with other collaborators like the Nature Conservancy, and they're integrating some of their, I think it's called, I can't remember, it was Healthy Cities Initiative. So now we're also, integrating that as an option within iTree. What we want to do is eventually get this particular tool to allow you to start pinning trees so that they can be part of a global map. But it does also have some limitations too. So I thought what I try to do is kind of, just give you a quick demo of this. And if folks want to even follow along, you could try this out. So again, this is just mostly a general public tool. And it was really more so just created so that you can work with schools or work with volunteer groups or just homeowners, and trying to put something very simplified in your pocket and accessible without all the hoops that I kind of jumped through with, loading on a desktop, running parallels on a Mac and so forth. iTree on the go. So what I'm going to do now is actually break out of this PowerPoint. And if you want to try to follow along on a smartphone, this is the actual website, mytree.itreetools.org. What I could try to do is see if I could put that into chat, so you could just click on that if you want to open it up in a web browser, or you could just watch me kind of muddle through one of these examples, but it'll be just kind of a way if you want to try to play along just to see how it works on your end. So I'm going to pop out of this real quickly and actually open up a web browser. So again, it's just mytree.itreetools.org. Okay, so just bear with me. And let me open up a browser here. So this is what it looks like on a smartphone. It'll open up on a web browser too. So you can actually just open this up, on another web browser if you're in front of a computer too. And so it's a simple tool. It has some drop-down menus, English units, metric units, and there's a planting list that it actually kind of collects as you start populating. The about information is very limited. It doesn't tell you too much about the actual tool, it just takes you to the iTree website. So what I'm going to do is just kind of go ahead and get started and walk through this. So what you'll see is, like, when you first get started in here, it tries to generate a map, and it wants to try to locate you where you're at. And so if I click on this Find My Location, it'll try to locate me to where I'm at. So I'm up in Wisconsin. This is reasonably close to where I'm at. But you could also just enter in a name of a park or something like that too, Sarah Park. So you can see here Sarah Park in the window, and then you can zoom in on that too. So I know that I think Open Lands did a planting project near this corner. So this is, let's say, if we were interested in trying to use this right here, all you would do is just tap on the map, and then it kind of locates a tree. And so this is part of the pinning process. Now, right now, this doesn't really let you store this, and so it's kind of limited value. The idea would be in the future, you'd be able to come back to this and access this information or download that. So this is kind of the first stage of what this looks like, that actual pinning process. So say if this was a newly planted tree, I would just try to click over here, and then it would just move it and adjust it. And then so you can see here it says next, describe your tree. And then it has just a number of different drop-down menus here. So here I already had Sarah Park in here, but if this was, you know, a different team that you're, say, working with or so forth, you can enter that group name. And the idea with this is that this will give you somewhat of an identifier. So say if multiple people were working on a project, then it could aggregate that group. Right now it doesn't do that yet, but that's something that's, you know, we're looking at trying to build into this tool. So different types of projects. So it might be a new planting. You can use this on existing trees. Let's just say this is a new planting. Is this part of the Trillion Trees campaign? So this is something new that I think we want to link to. Right now, this will just take you back to a random page on the iTree website. It's not linked to this initiative, but there is an initiative called the Trillion Trees campaign. I think much of that has to do with actually kind of documenting a lot of trees that are being planted in large scale projects, and a number of different organizations are involved. So this is all fairly new. Much of this has just really been released or added into iTree within the past couple of weeks. So we'll just say no here. And then so here, this is your, you know, where you enter your tree species. And let's say this is, I think I use Kentucky coffee tree, but let's just say I'm planting a swamp white oak. And so you can see as you start typing, it starts kind of dynamically populating a list. So that's one of the things that it has a very extensive species list, but you have to kind of start typing. And so say if I were looking at a red oak, once I type red, you can see how it goes and searches for all things that have red in it. So even dawn redwood. And then once I kind of narrow it down, then it shows me the species that I want, say northern red oak. So I'll just leave it there, and you can work with scientific names if that's easier too, and you're more familiar with that. Tree condition, it gives you some information about the tree condition. You know, what does it mean by a good tree? And, you know, in iTree, it's saying that it's missing, say, 1 to 10% of its leaves. So it's just somewhat of a generic way of kind of, you know, trying to make what's difficult, because two people say, well, this tree is excellent. To me, it's fair because of many different reasons. So it's just trying to give you something to work with to try to make that particular distinction. We'll leave this at excellent. And then here's our diameter, trunk size. You can change it to circumference if you want. So if you're working with, say, a volunteer group and they don't have diameter tapes, and you're doing you know, live trees that have been established, that could be something where you could even make up your own circumference tapes just by measuring those out and still enter that data in there. And sun exposure. So sun exposure affects growth rates. And so this is just saying how much of the sun is this canopy receiving by sunlight. So all these questions tell you a little bit about that. They're kind of the help text. So you can kind of review those. And we'll say this is getting full sun. And even though this tree is you know, across the street, we'll just say that it's within 60 feet of a building, just so it can generate some energy effects. How old is the building? What this has to do is, like in iTree, the energy effects are impacted by the age of the building. So a newer building is going to be much more energy efficient. And whereas like an older building built before, say, the 1950s, and I know that neighborhood because that's my old neighborhood, Galewood, trees, you know, those are older buildings, 1950s, pre-1950s, not as energy efficient. So the energy effect of trees will be greater in this particular case. Then how far is it? We'll say it's far enough away. This also affects the energy effect. So it's both the distance from the tree to the building, the size of the tree, and then also the orientation or the direction of the tree. So this is asking from tree to building, and it gives you a little bit of a diagram here. We'll say that since those trees were across the street from that corner, that the tree that would be looking to the south. And I mentioned that there's this option now. This is something new too. So this is even new to me within the past week, as a Nature Conservancy has their Healthy Trees, Healthy Cities information on here. Again, this goes to being, a cooperating partner with the Nature Conservancy. They have their own program to collect this type of information so they can start documenting tree health. So this is an optional piece within here. You don't have to collect this. I'm not going to go through this just because there are a number of different variables, and then we can go down a slippery slope of talking about what are epicormic shoots and things like that. So this is an optional piece. You don't even have to do this, but I did want to mention that this is in here if you were so interested, or for folks who, do have familiarity with kind of evaluating some of these more health, pest disease type or type characteristics. So you could just say, no thanks, take me to the results in this particular case. So we have one tree here. And then we can either edit that tree if we wanted to go back, or just calculate the benefits. So I'll hit a calculator, and then you can see it returns back a list of the tree benefits here. This is a very small tree, 1.5 inch diameter. So, again, here, like going back to what we talked about with that university study, small trees do not provide much benefits. And so, it's giving you a snapshot of that point in time. So it has some limited value for very small trees. But, where this could help is if you have larger trees, just to show the difference, to say, here is why we need to make the case for post-planting maintenance to get a tree to maturity. So energy effects, very minimal at that point. I'm even surprised that it registered some. You'll see things like avoided energy emissions. So it's actually, what that is it's saying, well, because there are some energy benefits for these trees, that means that there's going to be less of a need for either heating or cooling at the power generation and avoided emissions. So it even takes into consideration some of the secondary effects of trees beyond just the planting site or at the home. So pollution removal, stormwater, carbon dioxide sequestered, storage for a small tree to date, which is down at the bottom here, is going to be very minimal. So, you can actually go back, return to my tree list, and then you could add in another tree if you so desired. And so, in this case, you might say, okay, I want to add in a more mature tree, and then you can do that also. So I won't go down this path again. One thing with this particular tree, with this particular application, is that you can't save a project. So think of this as a one and done type application. I would not try to do 50 trees on this, just because it's something that you really can't save. It's more just kind of a single couple tree entry, just to kind of more of an engagement type tool. So, but it's iTree in your pocket, can be run on a smartphone, and it's one of those simple type tools that you can start over with and share with people on the run. So any quick questions on iTree?
Yeah, if anybody's got a question, feel free to throw it in the chat. I actually did that for the ash tree in front of my apartment building. I did notice at the bottom, once I put it in, it looked like you had a chance to email the results. So, maybe you had a homeowner you wanted to show the benefits of, or something like that, or a way of maybe at least saving the record for that. So I did see that. Anything you would add to that, Al?
Yeah, that is one of the things that we're starting to add into some of the more newer and tools that are getting updated, is just a way to, share through social media. So posting it. And so we also have that in a couple other tools now. So that's something that is kind of, we're starting to integrate more in, is the ability just to share the results. So this is somewhat of a tool that's still in transition. I don't know the timeline, but one of the things that'll be nice is once you're able to pin, save trees, save a project, go to a global map. One of the things, is that when we build these tools, we don't always agree on rolling out some of the features. For me, I thought, well, how can you pin a tree but then not be able to go back and access it? So it's of a limited value, but So in my opinion, but it's, our developers say, well, it's the first stage and at least kind of it introduces the concept. But so it's somewhat of a work in progress still, but it is a tool that I think is just expanding. And now with the TNC and elements, linking to social media, and then just having the map interface too, it's a little bit more interactive and engaging. Anything else on MyTree, Al?
I did get a question from Treekeeper Ruda, who asks how iTree is funded.
Yeah, that's a good question. And so, iTree is predominantly funded by the U.S. Forest Service. So it's, it's your tax dollars primarily that fund a lot of this, but it's also cooperation from, and funded through those organizations like Davey and ISA and SMA, SUNY ESF, who also provide, resources, research, and in-kind matching services and funds too. So it's somewhat of a collaboratively funded project. And so we also do projects too now to actually go out and try to find funding. And funding is consistently a challenge. So it's not embedded as a program in the Forest Service that says this will be funded at X amount of dollars every year. So every year, Dave Nowak and Scott Macko, our project managers, have to go to Washington, or now it's probably done virtually, and you make the case for iTree. And so we rely a lot on like the users and their testimonies and their support. And then we also keep statistics of the use based on on the web tools and things that we can to try to show that, there is an increase in use of and interest in value of these tools. And then so new developments are also funded by organizations who help out or who are interested. So there's a tool called the Planting Calculator, and that was funded by Cal Wildfire and a couple of organizations out west. The tool I'm going to show you next, Landscape, was funded by the North American Association of State Foresters. So we rely on just a lot of collaboration, but the bulk of it is funded by the Forest Service and then also the partners.
And we did get a question in from Joel, who's going to take the course this spring and works for Chicago Park District. Asks, how can we get a copy of the iTree Eco software for download on our desktops? And I'm following along with you. I'm sure we all are, but if you are talking, there you go. You are unmuted.
Muted. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I was taking a sip of coffee. So I just went to the iTree Tools website, and from the homepage, I moved over to download. And so there's some text about downloading the software, and then it tells you right here, this is the Windows EXE, which is the executable. And so what this does is it'll actually just take you to a form. And all the form is just to allow us to kind of track that we have usage of the software. So, it's not used for anything else. We're not I'm going to send you junk mail or stuff like that. and what this will do is generate a download link. And then once you hit that link, actually I have one on my desktop here, this is what it'll look like. And so I just saved that to my desktop. It's a fairly substantial file. You can see this is 394 megabytes. So depending on your internet connection, it could take a couple minutes to download on a home connection. If you're working, say, like in Chicago Park District, you're going to need administrator rights. So you're going to probably need IT if you're trying to install it on a city or municipal or institution computer. That's one of the challenges with iTree Eco. But yeah, once you have this downloaded, all you do is right click on it and run it as administrator. It will load in a number of different softwares, like it'll actually run a check on your computer and see if you have the required softwares that it needs, and it might pull in a couple other softwares that it requires to run. And then once you have that, you would just come to your start menu, and then you would have iTree, an iTree folder, and you'd see all these different applications. Now, these aren't all part of the desktop software, like Design will just launch a web page, but Eco V6 would be right here. And so that's how you would get Eco onto your computer. And it'll take a little bit to power Eco up, but that's the process. One thing I will say is, if you notice, let me get back to the website while we're talking about that, because I'll forget about this. We've had this up here on this kind of ribbon at the top of the home page and all web pages. Improve iTree estimates coming soon. Soon is one of these words that's relative in iTree speak. It's a developer speak, I should say. But this is something we've been waiting for, is an update to iTree. So I would say hold off maybe about 2 weeks on installing iTree, just because we're going to probably have a new version hopefully coming out. We're told that we should have a test version sometime maybe next week, and then usually it takes a week after for that to be kind of vetted, and then there will be a new version. Otherwise, especially if you're working with an IT department, you go through the whole process and then you find out that you need them again to do the update. So some of these estimates are going to change. Just kind of, if you click on this, it'll take you to a newsletter that talks about a lot of the differences that we're integrating. New science is always coming down the pipeline. So there's a lot that will be coming in this next new version of iTree Eco, and that'll kind of filter through tools like MyTree, Design, the planting calculator, and so forth. So it took me a bit of off-road, but that was a good a good topic to kind of cover. So.
And got another question from Treekeeper Ruda. And for those of you who haven't asked a question, by all means, you should feel free to do so. Ruda asks, in what other countries or region is this being used the most outside of the United States?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I find on a daily basis, we help people now on 5 continents use iTree. Eco is a tool that primarily is used internationally, and I would say we have fully integrated versions of Eco now in Mexico, Canada, most of Europe, at least the European Union and the UK, Colombia, South Korea. But there's a number, and what that means is that they can basically use iTree Eco the same way you can in Chicago. And in some cases, the data is even better. It's more updated. Say South Korea was most recently integrated, and they have 2018 pollution data, whereas I think we are still behind them. We're usually a few years behind. So those countries you would see very good usage, but it's also used individually in individual cities. So places like Delhi, India, we've been doing a lot of work with them. Vietnam, we've been doing a lot of work with them also, and many other just global cities throughout the world right now. I'd say about half of the work that we do, both like on the technical support side, is helping people in other countries use iTree now. And then there's also more interest in developing other tools that work here in the States, trying to make them functional internationally. So yeah, we do a lot of work now with cooperators. The Forest Service International programs has an extensive network that we work with now in many different countries.
Great, thanks for that question and the answer. And I don't see any other questions there, but people feel free to ask. Otherwise, back to you, Al.
Okay, sounds good. Let me continue on and go back to the presentation. bear with me. So let's go to landscape. So the next tool I wanted to talk about is iTree Landscape. And let me just back up one real quickly here, and just to kind of orient us. So again, we talked about eco, we went to MyTree. Landscape is one of the aerial tools. So this is a newer tool, different scale, different type of application altogether. And so this one was funded by the NAASF. And the idea with this is they were really interested in, one of the things that we did not have at iTree was a way of doing things spatially. So, people are really interested in seeing the relationship in terms of maps, and then also being able to map things like ecosystem services. So this is one of these tools that takes just a ton of different types of information and makes them readily available at your fingertips. It takes some time to get used to using this tool and exploring it, but it's become one of my favorite tools of just looking at what I like to say is the relationship between trees, land, and people. So, what this does is it has just a number of different pre-processed layers in there. And so again, it's online. It doesn't require any installing software like iTree Eco. It's something that you can just go to that website, landscape.itreetools.org, or access it through the main website, and really just start exploring different areas and geographies. And you can see all types of different things. So it has multiple scales that it works at. So you can look at, say, counties, you could look at states, you could look at all things all the way down to census block groups, number of different government boundaries like Forest Service, national parks, and more. And then, how does an aerial tool derive canopy estimates or ecosystem service estimates? And so, that goes back to using part of it is based on that underlying iTree eco processing, but it also has a number of different, information that we have that's based on county statistics from the U.S. Forest Service's forest inventory analysis. So, we know information about every county, like what is the dominant species in a county, what is the size and other characteristics. That's all part of the Forest Service's FIA program. And then we also have urban forest information. So what we do is we develop these multipliers, and then we can apply them to different tree cover estimates. So if we know, let's say, like in this particular case, that there is a certain amount of canopy cover in, say, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, then we can apply a multiplier that says that that canopy cover is going to be providing X amount of stormwater reduction or a certain amount of carbon sequestration. So it is based on what we know about underlying structural characteristics from on the ground information, but you don't see that here, and it's just applying it on an aerial tool. So they're coarser estimates. So ultimately, this tool is something that it's going to give you some estimates on canopy, impervious cover, carbon, air pollution, hydrology, but the idea is that they're more coarse, and that, if you wanted true understanding, you then would move to a tool like iTree Eco, where you actually go out and physically measure and look at trees and capture the data. So, but it's a good entry-level gateway tool to that, and it can assist with a number of different things in understanding different relationships. And so some of the limitations to consider is that it does not always have the best data. So, what I'm showing you down here is that we have to make this at a national scale. So we don't always have, you can see on the left here, somewhat of this pixelated view is coarser 30 meter resolution of canopy cover, whereas right to the right, that is, sub-meter or 1 meter resolution, where you could actually see individual trees and house parcels along these roads. So in cases where we don't have good high resolution data, it defaults to using what we call NLCD, low resolution data. Good news is if you're in the Chicago region, that we do have good resolution there. So we do have this high resolution data, and we're getting more of it. And so here again, too, this is all things that are provided to us by other cooperators, and we integrate that into the tool. So in cases where you don't have it, say if you were looking at this tool where I'm at up in Wisconsin, it may be hit or miss in terms of the accuracy of some of the estimates. So let's keep going down there. So, how does this help you? And to me, this is, one of these tools where you can quickly engage a community and start to show them some of these relationships within their community of trees and ecosystem service, but you could also link it to things that might be of concern to the community too. And I'll show you that as we go along. One of the things with the Forest Service too is that they very much have an all lands approach. So, they're not just interested in street trees and park trees. It's how do we get beyond that and how do we get on private property? And this tool is looking at all canopy. And so it also allows us to be more strategic in terms of, where do we want to plant, where do we want to protect trees? And then also just, exploring those relationships. And a gateway tool, again, if you are trying to say, do an eco study, that's going to be a more significant time commitment. You can use this particular tool as a way of introducing concepts and saying, we know this preliminary information about our urban forest based on this aerial information, but we could know much more if we went out and measured and use another tool to kind of gather more accurate information. So you have a lot of different ways that you can use this. And then also one of the things that's really becoming more interesting and compelling is trying to make that link to things like environmental justice issues. So if we could bring in information about people, tie that to tree canopy and tree benefits, that also is of more interest now in society. And so this is one of the tools that allows us to kind of make those connections. So what I'm going to do is I have somewhat of a little bit of a canned view of iTree landscape that I use that I went back and dug through. And this is, I kind of tried to shorten this a bit, but I'll move through this a little bit quickly just to kind of show you some of these layers. And hopefully it won't be too much like drinking through a fire hose, but it'll give you a nice snapshot of like what this tool could do. And hopefully it'll kind of encourage you to do some exploration on your own. If you actually use this or teach somebody, it's kind of clunky because you have to scroll up and down constantly because you have a map, and then below the map, you have a lot of the data. So you'll see me integrate this, both in this PowerPoint, but that's what that arrow is kind of showing you. It's telling you, go down, and that's where you're going to see a lot of the information. But one of the ways when you would start this is just typing in your location. And so in this particular case, in the upper left, I just had Cicero, and you can look at, as we talked about, there's many different ways you can look at information by county, by census place, which would be cities, subdivisions. This particular boundary, these kind of powder blue lines, is actually a HUC 12 watershed. So these are watershed units. So you could actually do watershed scale analysis with this tool too. We're more interested or familiar with city boundaries, let's say. So this is kind of a nice way just to do a comparison of looking at some of these cities. And so, these are cities for you folks are all in the Chicago area, fairly familiar: Oak Park, River Forest, Cicero, Berwyn, Forest Park, North Riverside, and Riverside. So all just kind of, west of Chicago and along the Des Plaines River. And you can even see, the darker, greener areas, Oak Park, River Forest, compared to Cicero and Berwyn. So initially, those are all things that we know. If you're familiar with these particular cities, what I did there is just turned on all the different layers that you see. So this is shown as canopy, impervious, agricultural. So just a number of different land covers that you can see in here. But then you can also just look at, say, canopy. So, here now we can kind of get a better look at just the difference of canopy cover between, without knowing what it is, you can actually just visually see some of these differences. Say Riverside compared to Cicero, there's, significant more green along that Des Plaines River corridor and in some of the more affluent communities up there. And then we can also turn on some of the riparian areas. So we also have different layers now, brownfields. So we have some of the EPA brownfield sites. So this is just showing us, here's the I&M Canal, but you can also see some of the parks too, some of the, the lagoons here in Columbus Park, Douglas Park down here, which I heard Al talk about, and actually going to come back to Douglas Park too again. I'll tie in nicely to that previous conversation. So you can see some of these things in here that we're starting to add, and there's actually some new things. But one of the powerful things about this particular tools is it also allows us to understand people in these communities and some of the characteristics about the communities related to census information. So we could look at things like minority populations in these cities. We can look at underlying information, but related to home ownership, education attainment. So all the things that you can find in the census have been integrated into this too, so that we can then start making connections between tree canopy and some of these other variables. And so that allows us to kind of, make these connections just beyond what are the trees, what are the benefits, and then we could start to look at, what are the populations at risk, or how should we prioritize, limited efforts or resources. So this is kind of a nice way of looking at tying in trees along with people. So one of the other things too is available is we call health risk layers, and these are expanding too. So there's things like walkability. So this is based on a national walkability index. And so these darker green areas are communities that were just rated in this particular type of index as being more walkable. And in this index, I should say that, this has to do with having quick access to transportation, public transportation, and stores. So if you think of a place like Forest Park, that really is, one of those places where you can pretty much just access public transportation, and there's just a ton of stores around there. Whereas Riverside, which I would think is kind of more of an interesting place, just because of the landscape there, it's not as walkable, but that's just probably because there's less commerce there. So it doesn't take into things like public safety too. So this is just a walkability index, a national layer that we integrated in here, but it allows you to look at, those types of features. One of the other things I kind of find really interesting is the land surface temperature down at the bottom. I'm going to turn that on in a second, but I wanted to first go back to the canopy layer and show the riparian layers too, because land surface temperature, when I turn that on, what that's going to show us is the differences in temperature based on Landsat thermal imagery from a satellite. So, when you look at this, you think, wow, okay, this is just a complete bloodbath, but it's different shades of red. And you can see the areas along the river and the canal are actually light. And what this has shown us is it's based off a Landsat large scale image, and it's shown us the difference between the median. So the darker reds are hotter than the median, and the bluer colors are cooler. So it's kind of a relative type map. And so, you can naturally see the areas where, and here's our small parks too. So you can kind of see there's Columbus Park, there's Douglas Park. There are some differences there in the shading. And so you can start to look at, okay, we can see the canopy cover, and we know that River Forest and Riverside have more canopy than Cicero, and we can quantify that. But then we can also see, well, what does that mean in terms of the differences in temperature that canopy is providing? And so, the reason I bring up temperature is because this really is one of those things that has a big impact on things like heat island effect. And so here, this is almost, look at this, of a 5-degree difference between Cicero and River Forest. That's significant. That means that there is more power generation required for cooling, more emissions, more pollutants, more potential negative health impacts. So, those are ways that you can kind of look at, make the connection between trees, temperature, and then try to bridge that to things that would be of concern to the community. And so, yeah, we do get those same types of ecosystem services. And naturally, these are going to, this is carbon storage and sequestration, where you're going to see the areas in the communities that have more trees and canopy are providing more ecosystem services. Same with avoided runoff. So, the communities that have less tree cover are going to naturally be less. And again, I said below there is where you actually see all the data. And just to show you, it's not just that simple avoided runoff, but it's giving you hydrology effects. So rainfall interception, transpiration. So those are all different types of hydrology effects that it's trying to quantify. And then also for pollution, again, it's bringing in those health indices. So you can see here, again, it goes back to what is pollution removal tied to those different health indices that goes back to the iTree eco model. So, less asthma exacerbation incidents, less lost school days. And so you can see that there's a difference in these communities where they're having greater reduction of health impacts, negative health impacts, because they have greater tree quantity. Now, keep in mind, this also takes into consideration characteristics of the human population. So it also has to do with, are there more elderly people or more people at risk with conditions that would actually be tied to this. So again, here, it's just kind of a neat way of just exploring communities and then trying to do some comparisons. But we could also do it on a smaller scale. So this is the North Lawndale neighborhood, and this is Douglas Park here in the center, which we talked about earlier. So you can kind of see the greener area, and here's the boulevards over here. And this is actually where I grew up and went to grammar school down here along this boulevard, Spry School. So I know this area fairly well. I grew up in Little Village. And so, here again, too, we can kind of see the difference in Douglas Park, a lot more canopy. Now we're looking at things at a more granular scale. So this is canopy based on census blocks. So even within a neighborhood, we can kind of drill down and see that there's a difference between 36% canopy around Douglas Park and 7% in some of these preliminary areas. And then we could also tie in those negative temperature effects and see that same correlation there. And then also looking at the census information too. So now we're looking at, North Lawndale, even though, it's a small community, there's still some areas that have higher percentages of people that are living in the poverty level. And then also, if we were interested in trying to isolate or find where are the elderly populations that might be at risk too, we can kind of drill down at that level. So how does that all help us? So knowing that type of information along with trees and temperature, this tool also has the ability to do planting prioritization. So we can take these different variables and then allow landscape to kind of do what we call a custom scenario for prioritizing tree planting. So in this particular case, I'm looking at something where I have land surface temperature differences. So very hot areas, populations over 64, and a high percentage of poverty. And you could weight these. So you can weight these. So they really are, customizable to the things that you might be concerned about, or you can use some of the canned ones. And then what the application will do is return what we call a prioritization map. So it's picking up the blocks that you're looking at and saying, okay, this deepest red is the one that has the highest proportion, where you could have more impact if you were interested in trying to find a place where you had elderly people, high land surface temperature issues, and poverty. And so you could change those variables too within that community. And then say, okay, say you're interested in younger people and focusing on high asthma incident, poverty, and low tree stocking, and it'll give you those variables. And in some cases, it may be some of the same blocks. So it's just kind of a really neat way of looking at some of those relationships, again, between trees, people, and land. So this is landscape. I really like this tool, and especially when you're working in neighborhoods that you're familiar with and interested in. And so, knowing a lot about this area, because I grew up there, and I think the School of the Art Institute has been working on a project there to do some significant planting over time there. That's something that I've kind of enjoyed, finding how can we use tools like iTree to help them, be more efficient and effective, both with connecting trees to the people in that community, but also being more effective with their decision making. So that's all I kind of wanted to share with you on landscape, a tool for exploring. And I know that we're kind of running up late towards the end there, so I just wanted to wrap up. Tips if you want to learn more, start with the website, and ton of learning videos. So a lot of the things that I showed you, there are stepwise videos to go through a lot of the different processes, instruction manuals and guides. And really, don't be afraid to experiment and test things out on your own. It's only iTree. You can't break stuff. That's what's nice about it. And then, we also have help. So, our technical support email is info@itreetools.org. We all take turns between projects manning that. So sometimes I'll be there, but sometimes my other partners will as well. So with that, Al, I think I'll tie it up in a knot here and, open it up to any questions if there are any. So.
We've got two more questions from Treekeeper Ruda. And again, for those of you who haven't asked questions, by all means, feel free. Ruda asks, number one, how often does the data get updated for the layers in iLandscape? And then Ruda, I assume your second question is directed at the other Alan, not me. And we'll get to that once he addresses the first question.
Yeah, so for landscape, that's a good question too. And so we still have 2010 census information. 2020 would probably be a while before that gets updated. So I don't have a timeline on that. And as far as like the actual canopy impervious layer, the high resolution layer, that also is, I want to say, from 2010 too. And that was provided. And so that really kind of depends on the organization who provides those layers to us. So if we get more recent information, I know like Wisconsin DNR provided some information for their state. The whole state of Iowa actually has wall-to-wall coverage, high resolution cover in iLandscape, and theirs might be a little bit more updated. So it kind of depends on the area. Otherwise, it defaults back to the NLCD data, which I want to say is 2011. So updating is somewhat of a challenge for us just because that is a significant project and process to do. But we get new layers all the time. Like I think we actually just integrated in redlining information, and I'm not sure where that came from, if that was a Forest Service data set, but that too is another layer which speaks to social justice issues, which now is available in there. I still have to explore that myself. There's also climate layers in there too, which are fairly recent. So it's a bit of a kind of an ongoing process, but some of the base layers are older though.
And Ruda had just another question, like asking what was your background and what led you to working with the iTree software here?
Yeah, so that's interesting because my background actually isn't forestry. I started out as a manufacturing engineer. So I've worked in Melrose Park, programming machine tools to make injection mold bases and die-cast dies for 14 years. And then I became a volunteer for Cook County Forest Preserves clearing buckthorn. So that was about 25 years ago. So I started over, went back to school, and just started a long haul from going to volunteer, working from Cook County Forest Preserve, hauling brush, and then Lake County Forest Preserves, and then running a crew to doing restoration work, and then actually went to Wisconsin DNR and then on to Davey for about the past 13 years. So, Al and I were talking a little bit about the uncommon path to get where we are. And I guess mine is somewhat of that, but it started more just like a volunteer, just, doing something that I enjoyed, being out in the outside, working outside. And then ironically, now I'm back in front of computers. So
That's great. Thank you for sharing that background. You know, the personal stories are always really interesting. Just had a phone call with Cook County Forest Reserves this week about having tree keepers help them prune young trees. So yeah, tree keepers in Cook County Forest Reserves are gonna start building a relationship there. So everything ties together one way or the other. So
Yeah, some of my oldest friends, I think John McCabe is still there, and there's a couple other people I still know there.
great. Thanks for the questions, Ruda and Dan and Pete. And anybody else with any questions or comments, by all means, ask away. We don't have a, say a hard cutoff at 7:30, but we will wrap things up if there's nothing more to take in. Big thanks to Al for doing this. Just fantastic stuff. The layers in iLandscape are just fantastic and also really useful in terms of targeted tree planting. I know there's another tree keeper who's working with that, I believe with CRTI to try and do targeted tree planting for maximum impact. Anybody who's got to drop off, by all means, feel free to do so. Any last questions, please get them in there. We did record this. I will share this out. And before we all break off, if we can give Al a virtual round of applause for a great presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I
Great.
appreciate the opportunity to share this with you. And, having my roots as a volunteer, I know that you all do some important work. So don't ever hesitate to reach out to me if I can help with any questions or if you hit any walls. That's what we're here for.
Great. Well, I don't have anything more other than thank you once again. Thanks everybody for taking time out of your schedules to join us this evening. Please check out Service for the other events we have coming up. A couple of virtual tree walks. We've got an iNaturalist webinar for mid-April. And as always, shoot me an email if you've got any questions, and I will email those of you who are here this evening the presentation. And so thanks everybody, and that's all I've got. Feel free to log off, and you all know how to get a hold of me. And otherwise, have a great weekend, have a good evening, be safe, and here's to 2021.
Thanks, y'all. Stay safe.
Bye, everyone.
All right, thanks everybody. Let's bring this to a close.